The last time I spoke to you, it was a while ago, and I talked about vulnerability, I think, and I have decided to take my own words to heart and be vulnerable. So I feel nervous too. I was so inspired by you saying that you felt nervous. I don't always feel nervous when I speak, but I feel nervous today, and so I too am sticking to my speech. It's a good move. This month, we're coming up on the 18-year anniversary of me coming out as bisexual to my mother. 2003, Thanksgiving morning, to be exact. My mom isn't really the cooking type, so I wasn't interrupting like stuffing preparation. And she was very kind to me. Still, there's sort of like a je ne sais quoi about coming out right before a day of eating turkey with all your Baptist relatives. So why did I choose that morning? Looking back, I didn't choose it, really. I told my mom then because it had become too much work, felt too inauthentic, and felt too painful not to tell her anymore. And that's the same reason I'm talking to you about it today. Let me take a step back. We have just gone through a period of isolation, of enforced privacy. It's been a time of loss of loved ones and community and routine and coping mechanisms and dinner in restaurants and worry-free coughing and glasses that don't fog up inside a room. 18 months of massive isolation and loss, and it's not over yet. Every day takes a certain amount of fortitude just to get through. But the pandemic has also brought us gifts. And what I want to talk about today is the ways in which this time, for all its loss and pain and uncertainty, has also brought clarity. Times of upheaval unearth truths in us. And sometimes they raise into greater consciousness things that we already knew. I want to talk about the gifts that those truths can be. And finally, I want to talk about whether we can return to the world being the same selves we were when we began the pandemic and left it. Spoiler alert, I don't think we can. We've changed. We've deepened into ourselves in ways that have changed us. I know I have. And a lot of what we learned are truths that we already knew, but we've now begun to know more deeply. Truths that we may have sat alone with for months now. And as we creep gradually back into public life, we're bumping up against our need to integrate those truths into the selves we present to the world. I thought was mine. That was very typical of me to leave my phone on. My therapist said to me last week that our lives are like two circles: our public personas and our true selves. And that the greater the gap between those two circles, the greater the sense of dis-ease that is felt by us and by those around us. I think she's right. I said, I think you're right, but did you hear about Aaron Rodgers, and can we talk about that? Of course, there are parts of ourselves that we keep private, things that the world doesn't need to know, doesn't deserve to know, shouldn't know. But there are also gaps that cause pain and prevent us from showing up fully in the world. So let's talk about those two circles. First, the circle of the true self. For me, during this time of solitude, my true self has had time and space to etch itself more clearly into my consciousness. And I've become more conscious of parts of myself that for years have been obscured by A, my perceptions of public opinion, because before the pandemic, I saw public opinion everywhere I looked, and B, by my own constant motion, because suddenly habits that had allowed me to avoid my feelings, like travel and gigs and visits with friends and having one too many beers at the Coyote during a Packer game, were erased. So things became clear to me that hadn't been clear before. So what does that do to the second circle, the circle of the public self? For me, having a clearer definition of my private self meant that my public self, to which I have begun returning as the pandemic diminishes, we all have, felt more distant from the truth. There was a greater sense of that gap, that dis-ease that my therapist was talking about. And that meant it was time for me to look for ways to bring those two circles closer together. In my own life, some of the things that have become clear to me during this time are big, and some are small. Most of them I already knew. For example, it's become clear to me that I find it really hard to play songs for people who aren't listening. I've known that on some level for years, but I made a lot of money doing it that way, and I don't know how long it would have taken me to admit that was true if there were no pandemic. Another example, it has become clear to me that I only want to wear comfortable pants from now on. As Anne Lamott puts it, don't wear pants that judge you. Life is too short. Without a pandemic, it might have been years before I realized just how true that is. So what I want to ask you today is, what has become so clear to you, so true, that you need to live into it publicly? Is there anything like that in your life? For me, the biggest truth I already knew, which I now need to live into publicly, is the fact of my bisexuality, which I sometimes refer to as being bi or being queer. I wrestled as I wrote this talk with the question of whether my own experience of queerness might be too specific to resonate with you, no matter what your own journey has been. But I'm trusting a lesson that I've learned from songwriting, which is that universal truths live in specific details. So I'm going to tell you a little bit today about my journey in hopes that some of it might resonate for you, some of you, and help you live into questions of authenticity and honesty in your own life. I am bisexual. That means I'm attracted to both men and women. I've dated both men and women. Since 2008, I've been with a man. You know him maybe, my husband Rich. We got married 7 years ago. And I'd like to pause here and make it clear that living in a heterosexual marriage affords me a lot of privilege and safety that other queer folks lack. I generally pass as straight even if I'm actively trying not to. And even now, when we're more open to non-straight sexualities than any other time in history, we live in a heteronormative world. Homophobia is pervasive, heterosexual privilege is everywhere. So I want to acknowledge that. I live in that privilege a lot of the time. I first began to realize I was not straight my freshman year of college at an a cappella concert where my fellow Carleton College student, Emily Fisher, was singing. If you had seen Emily Fisher sing, you too might have realized you were not straight. It was something else. That was the first moment that I consciously understood I was attracted to women, or attracted to anyone, really. Looking back, though, there are plenty of experiences earlier in my life that I now see through a lens of queerness. Like meeting my middle school friend Hillary, a hockey player with curly hair and a stunning smile who I wanted nothing more than to be around all the time. Or like watching Kate Winslet in Titanic. Or watching Kate Winslet in Sense and Sensibility. Or watching Kate Winslet in anything. Luckily for me, I grew up in the golden age of Kate Winslet on screen. I also grew up in the world of the conservative evangelical church, just as issues of gay rights were starting to seep into the public mainstream. Ellen DeGeneres came out on TV 10 days after I turned 11 in the spring of my 6th grade year, and my church took notice. In middle school, sex was the topic of almost all of our youth group conversations, mainly how to make sure you didn't have it until you were married, or maybe never ever at all, and if you did, how sinful it would be to have it with a person of the same sex. I learned at Christian sleepaway camp that AIDS was the curse of the gays, as they called us there. In 7th grade, my youth leader said to the group, "I hate the gays. I can't stand them." I'm sure some of you have heard worse by far. After that, my youth leader said, "But God says I have to love them, so I do." Clearly, he did. All that talk had an impact on me. And so it was that it took me 2 years after that Emily Fisher concert to really admit to myself that I was attracted to women. Compounding the situation was the fact that I also learned in that time that I was attracted to men. And we don't talk about bisexuality in our culture very much. We like people to be all one way. It's easier to understand. It's easier to predict. Even the most accepting among us sometimes miss the possibility of the both and. We don't think about it. Sometimes we get pulled into harmful stereotypes. When I was 13, the Friends character Phoebe Buffay really summed it up when she sang her original song. Sometimes men love women, sometimes men love men. And then there are bisexuals, but some say they're just kidding themselves. La 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 la. It's the real hit. After I realized I liked women and I liked men, and I came out to myself as bisexual, I started to learn how to come out to other people, and it was hard for me. But I did eventually start to come out on days other than Thanksgiving and other major holidays. After college, I started dating a woman, my longest relationship before my marriage, and coming out became way easier. Before I started dating her, I often wished something would force me to come out, so I didn't have to make the call in any given interaction of whether to broach the subject or not. And I discovered that nothing forced the subject quite like introducing someone to my girlfriend. Still, even then, people saw only who I was dating at the time. My queerness was visible then, but my bisexuality was not. When my now husband, Rich, appeared in my life, I was surprised to find myself dating a man, and I was even a little disappointed. Because what little comfort I had with my own queerness had been a long time coming, and it had been a hard one. But I came to love Rich deeply and to trust him intimately. He knew from the beginning that I was queer. He wasn't threatened by it. He respected all of me. He is great. And so after 5 years of dating, we decided to get married and create a life together. That decision, too, was a long time coming, and it was hard won. My relationship with him, the security and joy it brings me, the way we choose to be kind to one another, is one of the things I'm proudest of in my whole life. But in a lot of ways, my marriage pushed me back into the closet. People I had known pre-Rich thought maybe I had finished my experimental queer phase and come out on the other side into the solid ground of heterosexuality. Some thought I must not have actually been queer in the first place. And people I met post-Rich generally assumed I was straight, and I can't blame them. If you're monogamous with a person of either gender, bisexuality is invisible unless you make it visible. I didn't know how to make it visible. And so as I built a career in music, a career that included a certain amount of small town or international, thank you, Cindy, folk music scale notoriety, my public persona appeared straight by default. And that straight by default perception extended into my personal life as well. On some level, this never felt right to me. But for years, I tried and failed to come up with any good reason why the world should care. Why should it matter who I was attracted to, who I had dated in the past, if I'd now chosen a life mate? When I did bring up bisexuality to friends or family or acquaintances in the years after I started dating Rich, a few of them really understood. A few of them were bi too. They still are. But I often encountered discomfort or sometimes outright resistance. Some people seemed to think it was exhibitionistic to talk about, or that it was an expression of dissatisfaction in my marriage. Some people seemed to think I'd given up my place in the queer community, that I didn't deserve to call myself part of that community anymore. And some people equated bisexuality with promiscuity or non-monogamy. It's a common myth, but it couldn't be farther from my own truth. And so I grew quiet. I let those two circles of my life, the private one and the public one, drift further and further apart because that was the easier thing to do, and because I felt I didn't have the right to bring them together. Turns out I'm not alone. According to a Gallup poll, a majority of adults in the LGBTQ community, 55%, identify as bisexual. But we are much less likely to be out. A study by the Pew Research Center found that only 28% of bisexual people said they were out to most or all of the important people in their lives, compared with 77% of gay men and 71% of lesbians. This invisibility or identity erasure can take its toll. This summer, the New York Times quoted a 2017 review of 52 different studies, finding that bisexual people had higher rates of depression and anxiety than straight people, and higher or equivalent rates of depression and anxiety than other queer people. The Trevor Project found that bisexual high school students reported more feelings of sadness and hopelessness and more thoughts of suicide than those who identified as heterosexual or as gay. This is exactly the kind of dis-ease my therapist was talking about. The dis-ease that happens when the circle of one's true self is different from the circle of one's public self. Like any good mask, the gap between my private and public circles shielded me, but it also made it harder to breathe. And like I mentioned before, even the best masks really fog up your glasses. During that time, I've tried to find ways to breathe and to see clearly and to be seen clearly. I made a music video with a queer relationship in it, and I wondered if that would make anyone see the real me. I put a queer character in a play I wrote, and I wondered if that would make anyone see the real me. I wrote love songs with female pronouns and wondered if they would make anyone see the real me. I wanted so much to be seen. And then came the pandemic. Suddenly no one saw me anymore in any way except over the shiny waves of a Zoom screen. I didn't play gigs for people who weren't listening. I wore comfortable pants, and I thought a lot about my sexuality. I wish I could tell you when exactly things changed for me during the course of the pandemic, but I can't. I can give you a few little snippets. I watched an episode of Sex Education, an amazing Netflix show. Highly recommend if you haven't seen it yet. In it, a character named Ola, a bisexual high school student, a girl, shows up for a date with her boyfriend, Otis, wearing a tux. I was shocked at how much it meant to me to see that on screen, to see a bi woman show up for a date with a man looking queer. It hadn't occurred to me that one could do such a thing. I didn't know girls who dated men were allowed to wear suits anymore. I cried. I watched David Rose, the bisexual man at the center of the show Schitt's Creek, and the straight-ahead normalization of bisexuality that that show provided. That meant so much. I saw my friend Kate post on Facebook about being bisexual. She said, coming out as bi has always felt to her like too much and not enough at the same time. That felt so true to me. Gradually through all these things, I started to feel a little more seen, and that helped me see myself better. I started wondering what would happen if I chose to make myself more visible. None of these things made me start shouting about bisexuality from the heavens, but taken together, they added up. All that alone time, as I saw those things, that added up. All that time living and breathing without thinking about how other people were looking at me at any given moment, that added up. For so long, I had thought, this is true about me, but why should it matter? And what I came to believe during the pandemic is, it matters because it is true. It matters because it matters to me. So I have started looking for places to bring my circles closer together. I stuck a Bi Pride sticker on my water bottle. Turns out it's a poor quality sticker and it's already fading. So the world of adhesive wants me back in the closet. Instead of just writing songs with female pronouns, I wrote a whole song about growing up queer in that conservative youth group. I wrote about my sexuality openly on Facebook, and I felt lifted up by the responses and support that I got. A close friend of mine wrote to me after that to tell me he was bi too. I would never have known otherwise. I wore a suit to the Bob Dylan show Rich and I played at the auditorium a few weeks ago, and let me tell you, I felt like $1 million. And then I decided to talk to you about this today. It's almost like I've been swimming in water that was a certain temperature for so long, I forgot I was swimming in it, until all of a sudden during the pandemic, I touched the air, and I realized what a temperature difference there was. Realizing that difference has been a great gift. Decreasing that difference since then has felt hard. It has often felt like work, but it has also felt really good. As I said before, not everything that is private is meant to be out in the open. It's different for everyone, and the two circles of our lives are separate for a reason. We all live inner lives and outer lives. But in a perfect world, those two circles wouldn't be farther apart than we want them to be. Not so far apart as to create a sense of dis-ease or to make us feel invisible. What are the ways in which you wish you were seen more? Maybe there's an experience of grief or abuse or chronic pain or shame or addiction or joy or love that feels invisible to the world, that you wish weren't quite so invisible. Maybe there are parts of you that feel hidden. Maybe there are masks you are wearing, besides the literal kind, which you are also wearing, that are making it hard to breathe. Maybe there are places you can bring your two circles together a little more closely. I think for me, this is just one more step in becoming my truest self, a journey I'll be on until I die. This is a big step, but it's neither the beginning nor the end of the process. These circles of mine are always going to be shifting. But for me, this pandemic has been about learning what I already knew and using those lessons to bring the circles a little bit closer together.